happy to bring you a first-hand story of world history through the eyes of a loyal American hero.
In May of 1942, we boarded a transport ship. There were only our company plus 450 oil workers that were going to Ireland to lay a pipeline from Londonderry into the interior of Ireland so that gasoline and crude oil could be transported to Ireland to support the armies. We were stationed in Northern Ireland for about 6 months, and apparently the move was successful because Hitler did not invade the British Isles as had been predicted. We moved across into England and stayed about 6 weeks, and we were back aboard ship and transported to Oran, Algiers in North Africa. The invasion had been a few days before our landings, and we were considered the second wave of the invasion of North Africa in November 1942. We were in occasional contact with the Germans all the way across the top layer of North Africa, from Oran to Tunis, which was a distance of about 1,600 miles, and that was in November and until March 1943. Our opposition strengthened considerably when we met up with Rommel and his 8th Army that was advancing from the south across North Africa, and the tanks we had was no match for the German 88 millimeter artillery. The projectile would penetrate the turret of our tanks, explode inside, and leave a terrible mess of the 5 soldiers inside. We lost 150 tanks in the 3-day battle of Kasserine against Rommel, and there is the saying that a tanker is no good without a tank. That is very true, because approximately 5,000 American soldiers were taken prisoner by the Germans.
The following excerpt is an account of how he became a prisoner of war. Starting on page 100. We sat down upon the edge of an irrigation ditch to have a bite to eat. We each opened a can of sea rations, but I can't remember what the can contained. I do recall that we had just begun eating when we saw a man approaching us. He appeared to be another American at first glance. However, when he got within about 50 feet of us, he began firing a round of ammunition into the ground, between Brown and myself. We suddenly lost our appetites, for we knew then he was the enemy. He proceeded toward us, making gestures for us to put our hands in the air and surrender. At that moment, a terrible feeling of helplessness came over me. A dozen things were running through my mind all at the same time. Have I let my country down? Have I done my duty? Should I stand up and be a hero? Was it useless to face the tanks that were stationed around us? It was then he motioned for us to disarm. We unhooked our holsters and ammunition belts and let them fall to the ground. Our canteen, mess kits, hand grenades, and firearms fell to the ground also. The German kicked the guns out of the way and motioned for us to move to the right. We had only taken a few steps when, obviously, he realized we would need our canteens and mess kits, so he motioned for us to go back and retrieve them. Then we were directed to proceed. We went on a short distance, where we came to a fork in the road, beyond 2 steep embankments. There, the enemy was holding a large group of prisoners. There were many Americans in the crowded group, and we were shoved in among them. We were all crammed so close together, I thought we were going to smother. The Germans had their machine guns set up in half tracks, and their weapons carriers were on the road. Our greatest fear at that moment was that the machine guns would start firing at us at any time. It seemed like hours before we were told to march behind the Germans. Many things went through my mind during that time. Will I survive this? What will my company think of me when this is all over if I survive? What will happen next? The Germans noticed that several of us were wearing our kid leather gloves, and they were obviously a novelty to them, for they began taking our gloves. I was wearing a combat suit, which was an overall type suit that had no pockets. However, before the Germans got to me in their quest of confiscating our gloves, I was able to cut a slit in the combat suit and slip my gloves into the pocket of the fatigues I was wearing underneath. The Germans not only took our gloves, but took our rings and watches if they chose. They were rough with us physically and showed no respect in any way for us as being fellow humans. While we stood there, packed together like sardines in a can, we watched the German officers up on the roadway who were trying to decide what to do with us. Had our situation not been so grave, their animated features and frustrated conversation, which relayed how disorganized they were, would have been quite comical.
We walked the 70 miles to Tunis and were housed in outside prison behind bar outside of Tunis, and we were awaiting air transportation to take us out of North Africa because there was no German boats able to get into the Mediterranean Sea because the British and American navies had the sea blockaded. We were fed sparsely while we were in this bar camp for about 4 days. And finally, we were taken out and marched across Tunis to the airport. And that morning, there was not enough airplanes to transport us across, so we marched back to the prison camp by a different street through Tunis in order to display the American captives to the local people. That happened 3 times. The 3rd time was a charm for my unit. We were loaded on very quaint transport planes, I believe the Ju-88, and it was doubtful whether or not they could make it across the straits to Palermo, Sicily. But we made it across. So some of the German planes were not as fortunate. They ran across American planes returning from a bombing raid over Italy, and were introduced to a few shots from the American planes, but not much damage. The time we spent in Palermo, Sicily, outside of Palermo, was very dangerous because the Americans were making preparation to invade Sicily, and the bombing occurred both day and night. While we were there, 4 times we were bombed. In the 4 days we were in the camp on Palermo. Then we were crowded into boxcars and taken to a prison camp about 20 miles outside of Naples, Italy. And that was the most uncomfortable time of my prison life. There were no buildings whatsoever. This was the latter part of March. Wind was very cold, and we were in no buildings whatsoever. We were just in the trenches that had been dug by former transit prisoners of war. We were there for almost 2 weeks, and then were crowded into boxcars again, and through the Brenner Pass into Italy. We were in Italy for about 2 weeks, and then back into the boxcar, going through Brenner Pass into Germany. We were transported to Stalag 7A, where we were photographed, fingerprinted, and interviewed for a German record for upon us. And the photograph and fingerprints were put in the record and kept by the Germans. We were in Stalag 7A for approximately 2 weeks, and then back into boxcars, and you could imagine 60 bodies crowded into a small Italian railroad car, which was about half the size of the American railroad cars, and there was standing room only, and the only toilet facilities was a 5-gallon bucket. We spent 6 days in there with quick stops for soup and bread along the way, infrequently. And we were taken to Stalag 3A, and Stalag 3B. And I spent almost 2 years at Stalag 3B. I still had that razor blade in my pocket when I was taken prisoner, and many of us used that razor blade. Someone in the barracks had a razor that would fit a double-edged blade, and we cooperated, and many of us used that razor blade to shave with until it became so dull we couldn't shave, so we would put it in a drinking glass, rub it back and forth to sharpen the razor blade, and then we'd get a few more shaves out of it, and until we were able to get razor blades mail from home. And by this time the Russian army was on the move, and we were this prison camp was near the Polish border, and it was evident that the Russians was going to overrun the prison camp. The Germans started us to walking. At midnight on January the 31st, 1945, at midnight in the 8 inches of snow, near zero weather, we packed up every smidgen of belonging we had and started the walk, and that walk lasted for 6 days with stops at night in various buildings like churches, filling stations, any place that they could run a few folks into a building at night. And early next morning we were back on the road again, and there's where my feet became frostbitten, my hands, face frostbitten. Today I cannot drink hot coffee without adding 2 ice cubes. So it's a lasting thing, and my feet stay cold all the time, attested to by my wife. We were ended up at Stalag 3A, and about 2 months later, on April 22nd, 1945, the Russian army caught up with us and liberated the prison camp. And don't let anyone tell you that the Russians are friendly. They treat us more harshly than the Germans had. The Russians were barbaric. They had no kitchen truck or supply truck with their companies. The Russian soldiers lived off of what they captured that day from the Germans. Be it a farm place, they would take the cattle, bring our beef in on the hoof. We had to do our own slaughter and butcher. Fortunately, there's some good old Kentucky boys alongside that could do the butchering and quartering of the beef. There's a warehouse of peas. They'd bring us a sack of peas, and we had to cook those for a meal. Food was very, very scarce with the Russians.